2007 through 2013 Acura MDX with a 3.7 liter engine, alternator replacement. I'm Brian Essick from How to Automotive. I'm going to walk you step by step through the process of changing out the alternator. So this vehicle had a bad bearing in the alternator, causing it to go out. As you can see, the battery light is on, it's not charging, and if you listen in the background, you can hear it whining. I'm going to be installing a denso remanufactured alternator. I will link it up in the description of the video. The first step we're going to do is disconnect the negative battery cable. So this vehicle's battery is not in the best of shape, and if yours is not, I recommend you replace the battery also. A bad battery can cause an alternator to go out. I recommended a new battery for this vehicle. The customer decided to go out and get one for himself, so I'm not going to be installing a new one in this video. But if yours is in bad shape, I recommend you test it and replace it if need be. Next, we're going to remove the top engine cover. There's a couple clips at the front here. You're going to just turn them 90 degrees like this. So I turned them 90 degrees counterclockwise, and you're going to lift the front up. And then the back has rubber grommets kind of holding it on that the cover's pressed into. So you'll pull it off like this and set aside. So once you get the engine cover off, the first thing you want to do is remove the engine oil dipstick here. We're going to be removing the alternator just below it, and we don't want to accidentally snap it off when we're working on it. So on the wiring harness right here, we need to remove the 10mm bolt. To do that, I'm just using a little wobbly socket and an extension. I'm using a Milwaukee cordless impact driver here to remove those bolts. You can use a hand or power tools. Now you'll follow the wiring harness down here, and there's this rubber grommets going over the main power feed going to the alternator. You need to pull this rubber boot back, and underneath this boot will be a 12mm nut that we need to remove. I just used about an 18-inch long extension and a 1/4-inch ratchet and cracked it free and took that nut off. Once you get that nut off, the wiring harness will start pulling up. Now we want to get the second connector on the alternator unplugged. You just want to reach around the back like this, squeeze the tab and pull it off. It also has a rubber boot going around it. They can kind of make it a little difficult to squeeze the tab, but the tab is towards the front of the car, closest to the radiator fan, so you'll squeeze that tab and pull that connector off. Now there's one more wire you'll want to disconnect. It goes to the AC compressor, so you can reach your hand down here like this and get to that tab. It has a little tab, and you'll squeeze it and pull it off. It looks like this. It has a green connector. To get some more slack in the wiring harness to get it out of our way, we need to follow it down, or actually follow it up here to this plastic piece right here, and there's these little tabs. You'll pull the tabs backwards and then lift upwards, and there's going to be a tab on the left and a tab on the right. So you'll follow the wire loom over, and then right here will be a second tab. You'll squeeze that or pull that tab backwards and then lift this upwards, and that'll free it from the little mounting perch, and then that'll give you enough slack to pull the wiring harness up like this and get it out of your way. I just flipped it up over here towards the power steering pump here and just out of my way. Next, I'm going to pull the power steering reservoir out of its bracket here. So you're going to squeeze this little metal tab back and then pull the reservoir upwards like this. We're going to leave the hoses all hooked up to it. We're just going to kind of tuck it off to the side. Now we need to remove the coolant overflow bottle here. There's a little screw here or a little clip here. You're going to pop this clip out. They make special pliers for removing these clips, or you can use like a little flat blade screwdriver and pick it out. Once you get it picked out, you can go ahead and take the cap here off. I like to just take it off and kind of flip it over here out of your way. Now you can take the bottle here and lift straight up. And then once you get it lifted straight up, you can kind of flex the AC line out of your way a little bit and then pull the bottle out. You can also maneuver the power steering reservoir left or right just to give you a little access. Once you get the reservoir out, you can see the little slots here on the reservoir where it mounts onto a little bracket below down there. So when you go to put it back in, it just goes straight back in. You can also remove this bracket right here that held the power steering reservoir. Our next step is to remove the belt. I'm using a 14mm flex head wrench here. It's made by Mountain. It's about 18 inches long. We're going to put it on the tensioner pulley down below. It's just below this hose right here. If you look right below it, there's the tensioner right there. And then we're going to rotate it counterclockwise, and that's going to spring the tension off. You can use a wrench like this, or you can use what a specialty tool for removing belts is a serpentine belt tool, such as this one right here made by Gear Wrench. I'll link these all up in the description of the video. So I have the wrench on the serpentine belt, and I'm going to push it counterclockwise towards the firewall and slip the belt off of one of my free hands. Now that I got the belt off, you can see the tensioner below here a little better. So it's just below the power steering hose here. It's not necessary to completely remove the belt, but I did to make a little room so I can film this. I will provide a diagram when we go to put it back on, so there'll be a diagram to show you the routing. Now we're going to start unbolting the alternator. There's two 12mm bolts right here at the corner. We need to remove this little bracket right here, this little triangle bracket. So you're going to need a 12mm deep socket or medium deep socket here to get onto the first bolt right here. And then there's a second bolt right behind it right here that you need to remove. So you're going to remove both of those bolts, and that little triangle bracket will come off. So once you get the two bolts removed, the triangle bracket's going to come out like this, and you can set it aside. You want to keep track of the bolts. The bolts are different. The longer one went in through the alternator and the bracket, and the shorter one went through the bracket, bolted up to the cylinder head. Now looking down at the alternator, we need to get to the 14mm bolt right down here at the corner of the alternator at the bottom down there. But before I do that, I decided to take out the AC line bracket here. There's a 10mm bolt here, and then a little further back is another 10mm bolt holding the bracket on. Now it gives us a little flexibility in the AC line here, so when we get the alternator unbolted, we can get the alternator out of the vehicle. To get to the 14mm, I'd use the deep socket with a little extension and then a flex head ratchet here and crack that bolt free. Usually once you get it loosened up a few threads, you can usually reach down there by hand and spin the bolt out. Now once you get the bottom bolt out, now you can take the alternator and kind of wiggle it back and forth, and kind of have to wiggle it left and right to get it out of the little perch that it's mounted onto. It's kind of like a little pinch bracket that holds it. So it takes a little bit of an effort to get it to pop out like this. Once you get it popped out like this, now you can start flexing the hoses like this out of your way, moving the coolant reservoir bottle or the power steering reservoir bottle out of your way, and pull the alternator up out of here. When I was removing the alternator, it kept hitting the bracket here for the power steering reservoir, so I went ahead and removed the 10mm bolt and removed the bracket. And that made it much easier to get the alternator out. So I got a tip for when you go to replace the alternator. This little portion of the alternators have a little saddle that they sit in between, and they have an adjustable bushing. So if you look down here on the saddle, the little metal bushing at the bottom corner right here is designed to slide back and forth, and most of the time when you take an alternator out or put one in, they're pinched in and the alternator won't slide into the bracket here. Or depending on what type of car you're working on, if you have access, you can just tap it from the back with a little brass hammer and drive the bushing out. But in a lot of cases, they're too tight to get in there to do it. So what I do is I take a bolt like this here. This is about 2.5 inches long, and I slide it through like this. So I'm going to slide it through like this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a socket that fits over the bushing. It's bigger than the bushing here, so it's going to fit around the bushing. So this happens to be a 19mm socket, so I'm going to slide it over, and then I'm going to put a nut on the other side of the bolt there. And then what I'm going to do is tighten this nut, and as I tighten this nut here, it's going to pull the head of the bolt through and push that bushing in towards the socket. So it's going to pull that bushing inwards. So we only need to get it to go inwards a few millimeters, and that should be enough to get your alternator to slide into position. So in this case, I'm using a wrench to back it up, and I'm using a little shorty ratchet with a little flex head to get in here. These are not very tight, so they should move pretty freely or easily. So you're just going to do it a few turns, and then you can go ahead and remove the bolt. And if you look down here, this little bushing has moved forward, giving me a slightly bigger gap to slide the alternator in. So now you can take your alternator, slide it back down into position, and as you can see, it slid right into place. And even if you wiggle it, it has a little bit of play, so it helps it make it easy to start the bolts. So after performing that tip I just showed you, you can feed the alternator down into position, and it'll fit right in there, and you can start the bottom bolt. Now that you got the alternator in place and the bottom bolt started, we can put the top corner bracket on next. So you're going to put this into position and start the longer bolt onto the alternator and lift the alternator up, and then line it up with the bolt hole on the cylinder head. And you start both of the bolts. Like I was mentioning earlier, the longer bolt mounts through the bracket onto the alternator. So you're going to mount that one first, and then you're going to rotate it upwards, and you're going to start the shorter bolt. It goes through the bracket into the cylinder head. Once you get all the bolts started, then you can tighten all three of the bolts up. The two 12mm on top and the bottom 14mm. Now that you got the alternator back into place and all three of the bolts tightened up, the next step is to put the belt back on. Here's a diagram of how that belt routes, and here's a better view of that, where the tensioner is and the tool you're going to use. So we're going to route the belt the way the diagram shows. To get the belt on the lower pulleys, the crank pulleys and stuff, you can reach around the side through the fender skirt here, and put the belt on and hold it in place. Once you have it routed, you can rotate the tensioner counterclockwise and slip the belt on the rest of the way. Now we can start putting everything back together. We're going to flip the wiring harness here back down into position, and then we're going to hook everything up. The first thing I'm going to plug in is the AC compressor here with the green connector. So you're going to feed this down there. Then we'll plug in the electrical connector for the alternator, and then put the main battery feed to the top of the alternator on. So I'm standing in front of the vehicle, reaching down just below the alternator to plug in the AC compressor with the little green connector. There's just enough room to get your hands down there, and if you look from an angle, you can see it. It's maybe a little hard to do with the camera, but I'm able to angle my head down there where I can see what I'm doing. So we'll plug in the AC compressor first, then we'll plug in the plug for the back of the alternator second. Then we'll put the main power positive lead onto the back of the alternator and start the bolt and tighten it up, or the nut. When you tighten that nut up, you don't want to tighten it up too tight. The terminal that's mounted on is made out of brass, so it can break off easily. Once you got those three hooked up, then you can take the wire loom here and remount the 10mm bolt holding it down. You also want to take the main wire loom here and mount it back onto the bracket and slide it over the little tabs. Now with that secure, you can remount the 10mm bolts holding the brackets for the AC line here. After those mounted, you can take the radiator overflow bottle here and slide it back into position. It just slides down into the bracket down below. After you get that slid in there, you can mount the hose here that went through the bottle, and then put the clip back in that held it on. And then we're going to put the bracket here that held the power steering reservoir back into position, and then put the coolant reservoir bottle cap here back on. Put the reservoir back in, put the dipstick back in. Now we can put the top engine cover back on. A lot of times this little rubber grommets that mount on there will stick onto the cover. We need to pop them off the cover and put them back into the little port on the top of the intake here. So you'll do that, and you'll put the cover back on. And then you can go ahead and reconnect your negative battery cable. Hook up a voltmeter and make sure that everything is charging. I will link up all the parts and tools that I use in this video in the description. I'm Brian Esser from How To Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching my videos. Encourage you to subscribe. Invite you to head over to the howtoautomotive.com website for more valuable videos like this. Thank you again for watching.